I never thought the woods could hold a memory like a locked room, but the night I stepped into the Bitterroot backcountry, the forest felt alive in a way I can't forget. I had hunted these mountains for years, dense evergreens crowding the ridges, their resinous breath mixing with the cold. My boots pressed into a floor of wet needles that smelled of metal and rain. For 2 days the hunt had been routine, elk sign, crisp air, a silence that seemed to steady my heartbeat. Then, on the 3rd morning, the forest shifted. Just after dawn, a tree lay across the ground, only 30 paces from my tent, thick trunk I'd walked past the night before. Fresh splinters gleamed pale as bone in the weak light, the break so clean it looked twisted apart by invisible hands. No storm, no rut, no chainsaw. And around it, impressions in the soil shapes almost human, but too broad, with long, finger-like toes that pressed deep into the earth. My breath caught. Bears roam here, black and grisly, but their pads don't leave marks like this. I felt the weight of the woods lean closer. I set off north toward a string of elk prints I'd tracked the day before. The morning stayed unervingly still. My footsteps were the only sound, each crack of a twig ringing louder than it should. Then the trees opened to a small clearing. At first I thought a boulder blocked the path, dark and towering, but the outline breathed. Shoulders as wide as a doorway, arms so long they seemed to drag gravity behind them. Its coat was the color of wet iron, the light sliding across it like water. I froze. My first thought bear, a huge one on its hind legs, but it didn't move like a bear. It stood too straight, too deliberate, as if it were listening to the wind inside my chest. I raised my rifle, an old Remington that had steadied me through countless hunts, and aimed where the heart should be. The shot cracked through the valley. The figure rocked forward, then turned. The face still burns in my dreams, human and not. A wide mouth, teeth like pale shards, eyes small and calculating. Where the bullet struck, only a dark smear. No spray of blood. A sound followed neither roar nor scream, but a layered vibration that rattled the air, a noise that seemed to crawl into my teeth. It came for me. I tried to chamber another round, but the cartridge slipped from my shaking fingers. The thing crossed the clearing in leaps that swallowed yards like breaths. I turned and ran, heart hammering in a rhythm older than language. Branches whipped my face as I plunged into young firs, the forest closing behind me like a fist made of wilderness. Every crash of brush carried its own echo, one heavy stride, then another, always closer. The slope fell away under my boots. I slid, tumbled, hit a rock so hard the world went white. Pain detonated in my shoulder. I staggered up with one arm useless and saw a narrow crack in a boulder. Subscribe for more true wilderness encounters, cryptid investigations, and unsolved outdoor mysteries that keep adventurers and skeptics awake at night. A seam of shadow. I squeezed inside just as the creature reached the ridge above. It paced, breathing in gusts that stirred the moss from the stones, the sound like the storm's older brother grinding his teeth. I held my breath until my chest ached, sweat freezing against my neck. Minutes stretched into something unmeasured. At last its steps receded, deliberate and slow, as if it wanted me to know it was leaving on its own terms. I stayed in that stone throat until darkness settled like a heavy coat. When I finally limped back to camp, My tent was shredded as though a giant hand had clenched and torn. Supplies scattered like dry leaves. My quad's fuel tank gaped with a hole punched clean through the metal, gas bleeding into the soil. Deep scratches scored the frame marks that belonged to no tool and no animal I know. Staying meant death. I packed a flashlight, a little food, and started down the forest track under a sky that hid every star. Behind me, branches cracked, measured, patient. Something huge shadowed my path, never rushing, always matching my pace. Each time I slowed, the sound slowed too. The forest seemed to breathe in a language I couldn't speak. Hours later, a silhouette blocked the trail, tall, unmoving, darker than the night. My pulse thrashed. I turned off the path, forcing through undergrowth with my one good arm, praying the noise of my own stumbling wouldn't betray me. But the woods have no mercy. Every bush snagged my clothes. Every heartbeat felt like a beacon. When I finally dared to pause, the world was silent except for a slow, heavy breathing that wasn't mine 3 paces away. I turned my head. A massive shoulder, fur catching the beam of my fading flashlight, leaned from behind a tree. The creature stepped into view, eyes catching the weak light with a glint that held both animal wildness and something disturbingly aware. Across its chest, a dark stain marked where my bullet had done nothing. In its right hand it held my rifle. It tossed the weapon to the ground with a clatter that echoed like a verdict. The stock was splintered, the barrel bent into a mocking curve. Before I could blink, the figure melted back into the trees, soundless, as if the forest itself had swallowed it whole. I ran. The rest of that night is a blur of pain and cold, and the relentless sense that the woods were watching me breathe. Dawn found me stumbling onto a strip of asphalt that felt like salvation. Snow makes everything honest. It records weight, direction, hesitation, even the small ways a person lies to themselves about what they heard a moment ago. That night I drove out under a lid of cloud that rode a narrow thread through timber that leaned close enough to touch the windows. The park had gone to sleep for the season-locked gates, roofs crusted with powder, trails erased and waiting for spring boots. I liked winter duty. Fewer eyes on you, fewer stories to explain. I told myself I liked the quiet. I told myself a lot of things. Halfway to Lost Creek, the truck lights found an impossible answer in the road. A Douglas fir laid across both lanes, big as a bridge, the cut of its break so fresh it gleamed wet with a heartwood split. No wind, no rot. The surrounding snow was unwrinkled, except for a churned circle. Near the trunk where something had wrestled the bark loose in long, ragged strips 2 men high. I killed the engine and stepped into wool-thick stillness. My breath stitched a brief white flag in front of my face, and the forest answered with nothing at all. I walked the length of the trunk with a flashlight, waiting for a sensible explanation to arrive. There were marks in the drift that weren't tire treads or elk prints. They were bare, broad, almost like a man's foot, but with toes that seemed to unspool longer than they should, each pressed deep as if the snow had tried and failed to push back. They led away toward the densest trees and then vanished into bramble that swallowed light. I raised the radio, called in the blockage, heard the dispatcher say morning would have to solve it. That left me a choice I already knew I'd make. 3 kilometers isn't far in summer. In winter it is a country. I locked the truck, slung the big lantern, and started along the road's edge where the plow berm made a kind of hallway. Snow took my thigh more often than my knee, and every misstep folded the world up to my waist. Far out to my left, something cracked a limb, with a sound like a broom snapped across a knee. I stopped. The night didn't. Then it did everything, pausing so hard. It felt like the woods had bitten down on their own tongue. I kept moving. The lantern cones slid over tree after tree, their trunks standing like dark elevator doors down an endless corridor. That's when I heard the other noise, low at first, then rising, a draw-out rumble that wasn't wind, wasn't machine, wasn't any animal I'd logged in a dozen winters. It had a throat in it. It had a roof rattle in it. It felt like a warning from a throat as wide as the valley. I told myself moose. I told myself a bear that forgot how to crawl. The sound answered back with a second note closer. The buildings of Lost Creek announced themselves not by shape, but by their wrong light. A wavering yellow leaking from the equipment shed where no power should have been. The drifts around it had that smoothed, new snow look, except where the door had been worked, open and half the wall around the latch was crushed inward, not splintered like pried wood, but sunken like a fist through cardboard. I kept low as I moved to the window. The glass felt brittle even through my glove. I cupped the lantern and peered in. Something stood at the workbench with its back to me, shoulders shouldering the room, as if the walls were a size too small. The coat that covered it wasn't a coat. It was hair, coarse and heavy, matted in patches from snowmelt and sawdust. Its arms hung too long, the skin at the wrists showing where the hair thinned, gray-brown that wasn't human, wasn't any known that I could file. The big metal toolbox sat open, and those long hands rummaged without hurry, lifting a wrench, turning it, testing its weight, setting it down, as attentive as a mechanic listening for a phantom rattle. It turned. The face had the geography of us, but not the city planning brow a heavy shelf, nose wide as two thumbs pressed together, mouth wide with a line of teeth too even for something that lived by chance. The eyes found the window. They didn't flare, didn't blink against the glare. They held me with an appraisal that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with newness. I moved a step back and found the heel of my boot had seated in the low lip of a half-buried bucket. The metal made a small sound. It might as well have been a fire alarm. The shape in the shed pivoted, not like an animal startled to flight, but like a person deciding which exit to use. I was already moving, cutting away from the light into trees where the snow hadn't settled evenly. The door didn't slam open. It simply ceased to be a barrier, wood pushed aside with an indifference that carried no effort in it. The first hit caught me between the shoulders before I heard it coming. The way a wave will decide for you which direction you're about to face. I landed hard enough that breath felt like it had to find its way back. Bark pressed my cheek. Cold rinsed my spine. Footsteps came in a rhythm that hung low to the ground. I rolled and found a shadow arriving ahead of its mass. It took my jacket in a grip that made the zippered teeth complain and raised me so our faces shared the same cold. The smell wasn't rot. It was rain-dulled earth and old fur and a hint of metal, the way a workshop keeps a memory of filings. Its eyes didn't burn. Burning would have been easier to meet. They watched. The way a person watches a language over their shoulder in a crowded room, trying to place the accent. I felt an old rookie mistake coming, on the one where you talk to make yourself more real. My jaw twitched. I didn't speak. The lantern lay sideways 5 feet away, still on, the beam striping up a trunk. The shape set me down as if calibrating how gravity worked on me. Then it crouched, picked up the lantern. My radio lay in pieces that didn't look like they'd been stepped on so much as squeezed. Prints led away where sunrise gathered in their hollows. They walked the road a while, then cut up a rocky slope where snow thinned to a crust over stone, and then just ended. Not like they'd veered, not like a jump, as if the ground had decided to stop telling us what it knew. I walked the slope alone, the engine of one of the trucks idling below like a distant generator in a storm. A raven arrowed over me and let loose a croak that felt too practical for the scene. The wind came through a notch and turned my breath sideways. In the powder near a stunted pine, I found something that wasn't a footprint. It was a drag mark, shallow and smooth, as if a heavy cylinder had been pulled briefly through the snow and then lifted. It ran 3 feet and stopped. At the stop, half buried, a single tool lay with its handle snapped clean a big, adjustable wrench from our kit, the teeth shiny where they'd been tested on something. I knelt and touched the cold metal with my glove and felt an idea I didn't want start to assemble itself, curiosity with hands. A workshop taken apart to learn the alphabet of force. If that were true, the siren I'd triggered hadn't only hurt. It had taught. Back at the shed, one of the guys said bear and said it twice, like repeating a word closes a door. Another wanted to measure the span of the handprints on the broken door but couldn't bring himself to call them that. We loaded debris, took photographs that would sit on a server no one scrolls through unless insurance asks, and finally stood in the raw square where the building had been, breathing steam into gray air. I kept my face neutral and my eyes on the tree line. Once, only once, I thought I saw the ridge lift ahead where the timber thinned, a silhouette. That wasn't tree and wasn't rock. Then the cloud lowered, and it was the kind of nothing that makes you doubt. We drove back out the way we'd come, past the felled fir. The cut shone dull now, already oxidizing. Beside the trunk, a single print remained intact in a pocket of shade, deeper than my boot and shaped by something that knew how to put its weight where it counted. I didn't step in it. I didn't take a plaster cast. I let the sun have it. That night, off duty, I sat in my kitchen with the lights off and listened to the old house settle. Every tick of the baseboard and sigh of the refrigerator arranged itself into the same shape, a memory of hands that turned, wrenches by moonlight and tested beams, as if they were questions. When I finally stood to close the blinds, I caught my reflection in the window, and for a half-second before my eyes adjusted, I could have sworn there was another shape behind me, tall enough that its shoulders belonged to the dark above my head, still as a bruise, waiting to see whether I'd notice it had learned how to watch from farther away. The Bitterroot story never stopped echoing inside me, even as the years stretched and other duties filled the calendar. Winter patrols, lost hikers, quiet summers thick with pine dust routine was supposed to sand down memory. But the memory didn't dull. It changed temperature, like metal that stays cold in sunlight. By early 2011, I was working the far side of the country, assigned to the Crater Lake District, A park ringed by volcanic walls and silence deep enough to hear the pulse in your teeth. I told myself the move was for career growth. Maybe I just wanted distance from the Montana woods that still spoke in my dreams. Crater Lake wears winter like armor. Snow piles in layers so dense it swallows sound and makes headlights feel small. Nights stretch longer than they should, and the forest closes in around the caldera like a slow tide. I had learned to trust the quiet, to read the small cues, a squirrel that stays in its hole, a branch that shouldn't creak, the faint hiss of powder shifting in the dark. On a February night heavy with cloud, I set out for a routine inspection of the southern camps. Chains on the tires sang against frozen ruts. My radio murmured static, the only voice for miles. Halfway up the service road to Lost Creek, the world rearranged itself. A single Douglas fir lay across the track, its heartwood split bright as marrow. No wind had touched it. The air hung heavy and still. Around the trunk, impressions cratered the snow bear, wide, toes long as my own fingers, each print pressed so deep it looked poured in. They trailed off toward the thicker timber and dissolved where the shadows grew tight. My breath formed clouds I didn't trust. The engine ticked as it cooled, each sound too loud in the hush. I called dispatch, reported the blockage, got the usual answer, morning crew with a chainsaw, which meant I'd finish the patrol on foot. 3 kilometers isn't much until you measure it by the ache of thigh-deep drifts and the way a flashlight's beam dies just short of the next tree. Snow muffled everything except the deliberate crunch of something large pacing parallel to me, always just beyond sight. Branches snapped with the clean break of dry bones. I stopped. The forest paused with me, the echo of my own breath, the only proof of life. When the roar came, it carried no direction low at first, then expanding until the night itself vibrated. Not bear, not cougar, not anything I'd cataloged in a decade of ranger work. A pressure more than a sound, as if the mountain exhaled through a throat it shouldn't have. I forced myself forward, every muscle arguing. Soon the weak glow of a lantern, or what I thought was a lantern, flickered between the trunks ahead. The maintenance shed at Lost Creek wasn't wired for power in winter, but a shifting yellow light pulsed from its window, unsteady, alive. Through frosted glass I saw a shape that rewrote scale, shoulders grazing the rafters, arms long enough to lift the room. It moved with a slow, inquisitive rhythm, sorting through a metal toolbox as if weighing each piece for meaning. The coat of hair that covered it caught the lamplight like wet iron filings. For a moment it simply studied a wrench, turning it in careful hands. Then it turned toward the window, and I felt my stomach forget gravity. The face too human to be beast, too wild to be man-tilted. Eyes narrowing not in rage, but in recognition. I stepped back, and the bucket beneath the snow betrayed me with a dull clang. The door gave way without a crash, wood bending as if it understood who had priority. I ran. Snow clawed my shins, and the dark between trees became a tunnel that kept closing. Something massive moved behind me with a gait too measured for panic. Each footfall a soft concussion I felt in my ribs. A blow like a battering ram struck my back, and I flew forward into a drift, breath exploding out of me. A heavy presence pressed close. The air smelled of wet earth, iron, and a hint of musk like a wild animal that somehow knew fire. It lifted me by my jacket until we stood eye to eye. Those eyes were not the eyes of prey or predator. They examined me like a craftsman appraising a strange tool. My heart rattled, but I forced myself still, every instinct screaming to move. The creature lowered me, then stooped to pick up my fallen flashlight. It studied the beam, passing the glow across its own hand across my chest, as if comparing how light clung to different skins. I drew my radio, thumbed the emergency alarm. The siren shrieked, a blade of sound slicing the cold. The creature flinched hard, lantern dropping into the snow. It clutched its head, a guttural vibration rolling from its chest like distant thunder. The shed erupted in a chaos of metal and splintering wood behind us. I stumbled into the trees, lungs burning, every step a bargain between terror and gravity. The siren cut off abruptly, battery or claws. I'll never know, and the silence that followed was a different kind of noise, thick and alert. I reached the truck at last, the felled fur still bleeding pale sap across the road. New tracks marred its crown prints wider than my boots, leading over the trunk and fading into the endless timber. The engine coughed awake after a frozen heartbeat. In the side mirror, for one impossible moment, a darker shadow kept pace with the moving pines, stride for stride, until the headlights of the main road broke the night apart. At dawn, a team came to assess the damage. The shed was demolished as though a storm had been folded inside it and released. Walls peeled outward, the roof caved in, tools flung into drifts like scattered thoughts. Footprints ran to the base of a rocky rise and ended mid-slope. No slide marks, no continuation, just termination, as if the creature had stepped off the map. My crushed flashlight lay yards away, bent double, metal torn rather than dented. The official report said bear. They always say bear. But I watched seasoned rangers measure those prints in silence, none willing to meet another's eyes. One man ran a tape across the ruined door where something had pushed straight through the planks and then simply set the tape down, lips pressed thin. That night in my cabin, I tried to write the incident report and found my own words foreign. The memory of that gaze, patient and almost curious, seeped into every sentence. I kept seeing the way it held the lantern beam to its palm, as though it understood that light could be captured, studied, maybe even used. Sometimes when the wind scrapes the eaves, I wonder if the siren didn't just drive it off. It taught it something. Maybe about tools. Maybe about us. I never filed the details I'm telling you now. Paperwork can't hold a thing that watches, learns, and decides when to vanish. But I carry the image, eyes reflecting a narrow strip of light, the forest folding around it like a door that only opens inward. And every time the winter woods go quiet enough for me to hear my own blood, I know it's still out there, listening back. The years since that winter have thinned into seasons of work, moves, and long drives through forests that echo more than they speak. I tell myself I'm just another ranger who's seen too much wilderness storms that knock down cabins, cougars that vanish between heartbeats. But certain nights don't fade. They stay folded inside me like a map no one else is allowed to read. After Crater Lake, I transferred to a quieter post in northern Idaho. The paperwork said lateral move, but really it was distance. I wanted distance from the smell of cold pine, mixed with iron, from the sound of a siren cutting through a roar that wasn't quite animal. I learned to memorize every path by the angle of the moss, to track small things, a fox brushing a stump, a raven shifting its weight because the big thing I'd once seen refused to fit in any field guide. By late autumn of my first year there, I began waking in the small hours with the sense that the dark outside the window had weight, not a presence exactly, more like the pause before someone speaks your name. The dreams followed. A lantern beam stretched across fur, a pair of eyes considering me as if I were the strange one. I stopped trying to explain them. One evening, heavy clouds dragged the last light early from the sky. I took a patrol along a trail that skirted the Clearwater River, my boots tapping a rhythm against frozen soil. A few miles in, the forest shifted like someone turning a dimmer switch on the entire world. The river hushed, and the pines leaned inward until the trail felt like the throat of some sleeping giant. Then came the sound, a low tremor almost electrical, traveling through the trunks before it reached my ears. It wasn't the roar from Oregon, but it carried the same weight, as if the mountains themselves remembered. I rounded a bend and saw them. Impressions in the frosted earth, wide and bare, spaced like a stride too confident for a man. Each print held the memory of toes that reached farther than they should. They moved parallel to the trail for a dozen paces, then cut sharply into a thicket of young cedar where no human would bother to push through. My breath tightened. The prints weren't old. A dusting of fresh snow had only begun to soften their edges. I followed. Branches brushed my shoulders like question marks. The forest air thickened with a faint metallic scent, the same taste that once filled my mouth in Montana. 100 yards in, the ground opened to a clearing, lit by a thin seam of moonlight. At its center stood a fir with a fresh wound spiraling up its trunk bark, peeled high, fibers splayed outward as if twisted by hands with too much leverage. Around the base, the prints ended in a perfect circle. I waited. Wind moved through the crown of the trees, but left the clearing still. Somewhere beyond sight, a single knock echoed a hollow, deliberate rap of wood on wood. Then silence again, as if the sound had been a question and the forest was deciding how to answer. I should have turned back. Instead, I set the beam of my flashlight low and swept it across the far edge of the clearing. 2 reflections glinted between the trunks, eyes set higher than any person could stand. They didn't flare with animal panic. They held steady, like lanterns hung with intent. My heart stuttered against my ribs. For a long breath we regarded each other across that thin field of moonlight. Then the reflections blinked, slow, deliberate, and slipped behind the timber. No crash of branches, no retreating steps. Just absence. I stood there until the cold stiffened my knees. When I finally backed down the trail, the forest remained awake around me, but the prints behind me began to blur as light snow drifted down, erasing the path one soft grain at a time. I returned before dawn with a camera, but the clearing had gone back to ordinary, no tracks, no wound on the fur, only undisturbed white stretching to the river. I searched for hours, feeling the woods watch the way a quiet room notices a whisper. I never filed a report. What would I write that the wilderness kept its own ledger and I'd been allowed a glimpse? Instead, I keep the memory sealed, a story told only in the cadence of my own pulse when night presses close. Sometimes when the wind sifts through the pines outside my cabin, I think about the lantern in Crater Lake and the eyes in Montana. I wonder if these forests are less a place than a mind, something that learns, waits, and occasionally chooses to be seen. I wonder if the siren I triggered years ago wasn't just a warning, but an invitation, a sound that told whatever it was how to find me again. The question that lingers isn't whether it exists. It's what it remembers of me, and whether, in some far-off stretch of timber, it's standing perfectly still right now, watching the dark, waiting for the next time our paths cross and the world forgets which of us is supposed to be the hunter.